All right, we're going to combine a couple sections here because innervation is so short. So we're going to look at parts 2 and 3. We'll get into part 2 first and then get into part 3. But so for the next minute or so, we're going to talk about innervation of muscle cells, just talking about the somatic motor pathway, kind of look at the general innervation, and then we'll get into some more details. So remember that depending on which type of muscle we're looking at, we may be a somatic motor system or an autonomic motor system. Remember, a motor pathway is going to be from the central nervous system to the peripheral nervous system to cause an action. And that somatic is what we think of with voluntary. We're thinking skeletal muscle. Autonomic is involuntary. We're thinking cardiac. We're thinking smooth. And then do remember that autonomic can be split even further into the sympathetic division and the parasympathetic division, which we've already talked about these in the previous unit. So if we remember kind of how these things are different, remember the somatic nervous system, we have a single neuron that goes from the central nervous system to the effector. We're using acetylcholine as our neurotransmitter to allow for some sort of movement, right? On the autonomic side, the sympathetic one, we use a 2-neuron chain where the ganglia is closer to the spinal cord, with the exception of the adrenal medulla, which is directly innervated from the central nervous system. But we see that we are using norepinephrine. And then the parasympathetic side, also a 2-neuron chain, but it is the ganglion is closer to the effector, and we're using acetylcholine. Right, and depending on what we're doing, it might be stimulatory, it might be inhibitory, it depends on the neurotransmitter, right? It depends kind of like what side of the autonomic nervous system it's coming from. So you can just pause here and read through this. I'm not going to read this to you, but just remembering like who are the effectors, what's the general purpose, how many neurons from the central nervous system to the effector, how many ganglia, what neurotransmitters, and then like what would happen if there was nerve damage. So if we look at the basic innervation of the somatic motor system, right, just the basics here, we have our somatic motor neuron, see how it's innervated, or the cell body is in the gray matter of the spinal cord, right, in this case. So the motor neuron cell body is in the central nervous system, and then it reaches all the way out to the skeletal muscle, right, and it's going to innervate there. This is going to root in the ventral horn, right, and again, no ganglion, just all the way out, and this is what we call the motor unit. So that's why we did that one pretty short. We're going to roll it in with number 3 too, where we continue with the somatic motor pathways in more depth, looking at them up close. So we're going to talk about upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons. We're going to talk about the direct or the pyramidal pathway, as well as the indirect or the extrapyramidal pathway. Talk about the cerebral cortex's involvement, the cerebellum's involvement, the basal nuclei's involvement, and then look at some symptoms that we can experience with certain medications in terms of the extrapyramidal pathway. Look at different tracts, and then talk about muscle sensory organs, and then look at some reflexes. Now, we've talked about reflexes before, so some of these things I may go through relatively quickly. So the somatic motor pathway is taking information from the brain to the skeletal muscles, and so it's a descending pathway, right? It's descending from the central nervous system to the effector, in this case skeletal muscle. And we have 2 motor neurons and found in a series. We have one stemming from like the brain and moving down through the spinal cord, and then the motor neuron taking that from the spinal cord to the actual muscle cell. And so those first ones, right, are the upper motor neurons. They're carrying those voluntary impulses from the brain down, and they can carry it through one of 2 pathways, either a direct motor pathway or an indirect motor pathway. If it's direct, we're going from primary motor cortex down to the lower motor neurons. The indirect pathway, we are using basal nuclei, the cerebellum, then to the lower motor neurons. And then lower motor neurons are going to extend from one of 2 places, either the spinal cord, which is what I've been mentioning, so going to the muscles like in your arms and your legs and like your torso, or we're coming from the brain stem right through cranial nerves for like the face. And we have a few different spinal tracts, right, where we can descend down through. Notice the names. Notice the names. The lateral corticospinal tract, the anterior corticospinal tract. Those names are telling us where they're coming from and where they're going down. So the lateral corticospinal tract starts at the cortex of the brain and ends down through the spinal column. Hence the name corticospinal, right? Lateral tells us we're to the side, anterior tells us we're towards the front, right, of the spinal cord. These are for both motor control, fine and gross, meaning fine and like small movements, very fine detail, versus gross, which is like big movements. The rubrospinal tract is for arm movement, the reticulospinal tract and vestibulospinal tract for postural motor control, because we're getting information from like the vestibule. We're getting information on, on our body positioning and movement from there. And then the olivospinal tract, this is for head, neck, and eye movement. So let's go ahead and talk about the direct motor pathway. This is again going from that lower motor, going from the central nervous system to the lower motor neuron from the primary motor area of the cerebral cortex. So we start from the primary motor area, right, which is in the back of that frontal lobe. We pass through pyramids in the medulla, right? And this is what's going to give us like the very precise movements we can engage in. So the direct pathways can use the corticospinal tract, right? So again, we're going down through the cortex and the spine for the arms, the legs, and the trunk. And then the corticobulbar tracts, those are going to be for movements of the head. If we look at that primary motor area, again, it's right before the central gyrus, so it's the precentral gyrus, or right before the central sulcus, my apologies, but right before the central sulcus, we have the precentral gyrus. So it's at the back of the frontal lobe, right before we transition to the parietal lobe, and this is where we have most of our area being devoted to muscles, right, for skilled movements, delicate movements, complex movements, right? And we see this little homunculus that shows which parts of that precentral gyrus control what. And you see it kind of follows a pattern, right? From like things involved with the head and the face, moving down towards the upper limb, down towards the lower limb. The indirect pathway, right? This is where we have to go through a basal nuclei, the cerebellum, right, before we get to the lower motor neuron, right? This is for unconscious skeletal muscle movements, so things that maybe help you maintain posture that you're not necessarily aware of. Also, something you may have noticed looking at this picture and looking at this one is that we see some things are getting, at some point, right, are passing over to the other side, right? So we started over on one side, in this case on our left, on this person's right, and we ended on our right, or that person's left. And we see the same thing here, right? That's called contralateral, meaning that it's the brain is controlling the opposite side of the body. The cerebellum, again, is part of that indirect pathway, and this is so that we can maintain coordinated movements, maintain proper posture, maintain equilibrium, right? And so basically we're looking at, what are the intentions for the movements we're going to make, or the actual movements being made, comparing the command signals with sensory information, and then sending out corrective feedback so that if we overcompensate, let's say we need to maintain balance, we're swinging to the left, and so the brain allowed us to swing towards the right, the cerebellum can make sure we don't overcorrect, right, and that we can stay somewhere in the middle. So the cerebellum is going to receive information from some muscle spindles, from the Golgi tendon organs to help kind of see where we're at, right, see how we're positioned. Those basal nuclei, those are going to help us with maintaining the appropriate amount of muscle tone. They can inhibit other motor neuron circuits, right? There also are disorders of the basal nuclei that allow for uncontrollable abnormal movements called dyskinesias, like Parkinson's, Huntington's, Tourette's, right? These are, we find disorders within the basal nuclei. And then when some of these things get damaged, right? So let's say we've damaged a spinal nerve. We have what's called flaccid paralysis. This is where we have reduced muscle tone, reduced stretch reflexes. There's atrophy, so the legs let's say we're talking about legs. We would notice like that person with this particular problem would have problems where their muscles would be really, really small, really, really weak, right? This is caused by lesions due to peripheral neuropathy, polio, Guillain-Barre syndrome. And then if it's an upper motor neuron, right, this is going to result in spastic paralysis. So we have increased muscle tone, exaggerated reflexes, hyperactivity. The Babinski sign is there that shouldn't be. This is when we have like a stroke, head injury, spinal cord injury, cerebral palsy, Parkinson's, MS, right, things of that nature. And then if you have something like ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, this is where it can affect both of those levels. So we see muscle wasting, we see sclerosis, we see just, this is a person who would not be able to, they would be slowly paralyzed, but they would also have some other issues that may kind of overlap with other conditions like Parkinson's or cerebral palsy. So some of the symptoms that are induced by medications, right? A lot of the first generation of antipsychotics caused some of these things. It's not as severe anymore. And so this is, some of these are a bit on the older end, especially again with those original, what we call the first generation of antipsychotics, led to a lot of these symptoms where there was tremors, there was pacing, restlessness, grimacing eye movement, chewing, facial dyskinesia, involuntary movements, all sorts of stuff. And for some of those medications, if those things developed, there was like if I remember right, a 5% chance each year that someone could develop these types of symptoms, and that restarted every single year. So over the course of someone's lifetime, if they had to stay on these medications long term, they were likely to develop them at some point. And unfortunately, with some of those very early antipsychotics, these changes, these symptoms from these medications could be permanent. Right. I'll just pause here so you can read through these. I'm not going to necessarily test you or quiz you on these things, or I should say at least test you. They may be on a quiz here or there, but I won't necessarily test you on these things. But there's things to think about as you go forward. So when we look at the somatic motor pathway, how do we sense where we are, what we're doing? And we mentioned some of these. We mentioned like the Golgi tendon organ and the muscle spindle apparatus, or the muscle spindle receptors. And so let's go ahead and talk about them. The tendon organs, we find them in the tendon. They're basically going to respond to and detect the tension that a muscle puts on a tendon. So how much is it pulling right on that tendon? Whereas the muscle spindle apparatus, right, which is up in here, right, this is going to respond to changes in muscle length, right? The more control we need over that muscle, the more spindles, because again, this is giving our brain feedback on the muscle in terms of its stretching, in terms of its contraction, in terms of basically is the muscle working and how so. And so the muscles, as they stretch, will cause those spindles to stretch, and then as the spindles stretch, that will send the signal. We have a few different innervations that can occur depending on the muscle type. If it's a thin muscle cell, we have what's called intrafusal fibers, or that's what they're called. They're found inside the sheath wrapped by muscle spindles. These guys, they're innervated by gamma motor neurons, so they respond to changes in the muscle length as part of the stretch reflex. And then regular muscle fibers are called extrafusal fibers, right? They're going to be innervated by alpha motor neurons, and that's going to be for like the action, like the major action of the muscle in response to the tendon organ stimulation. Now here are some of those stretch reflexes. We've talked about this one. We talked about the patellar reflex and whatnot. And so I'm only going to go through this briefly, just as a reminder. Again, this is initiated by the muscle spindle. So when we tap on that knee, on the patellar ligament, right, that is going to pull, right, on the muscle, right, because we're pulling on it. When we pull on that, that's going to cause stretch. When we cause that stretch, then the muscle spindles also stretch and send out a signal. Right, from there, the sensory neuron gets excited. We send it to the spinal cord. Our interneuron then processes that and sends a signal out, right, so that we can contract back, right? We contract back to fight that stretch, which then causes the leg to kick out. We also notice that we relax the antagonistic muscles here, because if we're contracting the effector muscle, we need to relax the other side to prevent overstretching, to prevent damage, right, injury. The tendon reflex, this is when we put too much tension on the tendon, right? So here we have the tendon being overstimulated. So what happens, we send information to the excitatory or the sensory neuron. It gets excited. We interprocess that in the spinal cord, integrate that, and then we send out a signal. This is to pull the leg back so the antagonistic muscles contract, and then we relax the ones up top. In this case, we're looking at the top of the thigh. They'll get an inhibitory signal to relax. So this one kind of works almost like opposite of the patellar reflex we just looked at. We also talked about the Babinski reflex before. So again, very briefly, in a baby, if we trace something along the bottom of their foot, they will fan their toes up and out. Whereas in adult, we see that it changes from the Babinski reflex to the plantar reflex, that the toes curl inward. If we see a person as an adult demonstrating the Babinski reflex, and that means that there's probably some sort of damage, right? Something has happened. Either they have an injury, maybe they have a tumor, like a brain tumor, MS, ALS, something in the central nervous system has been damaged that's allowing them to do this infancy type response, or this reflex that only occurs in little babies.